now we're going to move forward into the stages of language acquisition. And we are going to cover some of these with Andrea's help. We dialogued about what would be, of the toolkit that I provide, what would be the most important items that you would need to know that I could deliver to you in these short sessions. So first, let's dive into some information about BICS and CALP. So this is foundational information to work with dual language learners. BICS is your basic interpersonal communication skills, and CALP is your cognitive academic language proficiency. And one of the things that I talk a lot about is changing your lens, how you look at dual language learners. So we need to learn more about this process and adjust how we look. So when I said, if you send me into a classroom, I am meant to find disorder. I have like a radar on, right? And one thing I would really highlight is that research also shows us, this one comes from this particular book, another really good one, Special Education Considerations for English Language Learners. This supports teams in how to proceed through these processes. And one of the things that they highlight is the evidence that shows that dual language learners in the classroom present very similarly to our children with special education needs. So when you observe a classroom, you will see tendencies, characteristics, behaviors that are very similar between special education students and dual language learners. They look very similar in the classroom. This is dangerous because what we're seeing stems from something very, very different, a difference versus a disability. And so we really have to be cautious in this process. And the first thing we can do to change our lens is be thoughtful and intentional in the way we look at students related to BICS and CALP. So your BICS, those are the skills that they need for social communication. It's the first type of communication acquired. It's rich in context. There's interactions, there's facial expressions, there's pictures, there's a shared TV screen. There's a lot of context to support our dual language learners. They occur in social situations, and these are skills that our dual language learners usually acquire within 2 years. We're going to start talking a lot about timeline because I get a lot of questions about how long should I wait and when should I refer and how many years. Remember, you just took an oath. You are not going to wait and see. We're going to use evidence-based information to make that decision. And I always say, I have BICS in Spanish. So I didn't talk about that because I'm trying to be efficient with y'all, but I am not bilingual. I am a monolingual evaluator who has done extensive training in how to evaluate dual language learners. I have BICS in Spanish. I can order some basic food. I can give a greeting. I can ask where the bathroom is. I can achieve these basic social interactions. However, I definitely could not work at a level with academic, or for me, my professional vernacular and the work that I do in Spanish. So CALP is cognitive academic language proficiency. This is what they need for academic learning. This is typically new and unfamiliar information. It is, has much less context. The teacher just stood up there and read a paragraph or read a chapter. There's not the context to support that information. It's learned exclusively from the language, not those situational cues that really help us with the BICS. And it may take 5 to 7 years or longer for our dual language learners to show proficiency in cognitive academic language proficiency. So I like to pose the question and have you reflect on, when a teacher is concerned, do they have BICS or do they have CALP concerns? Are they worried that Joey can't get along with other kids or converse on the playground or get his basic wants and needs met? Or are they worried about reading, writing, spelling, math? Are they worried about narratives? Are they worried about academic expectations? Because we have to step back and say, if this child is recently introduced to English, it can take 5 to 7 years to meet those grade level academic expectations. We have to change the expectations and individualize them to their cultural and linguistic background. And one of the things we have to really use as our lens, remember, we're changing our lens, is BICS and CALP. So if a teacher or an MTSS team comes to you and they have all of these academic concerns, I would say step back and pause for a moment. Do you know how to answer the 4 red flag questions? Do you know how long this child has been exposed to English? And should those be realistic expectations that we place on them if they are only recently introduced to using English? So I bring to you the stages of second language acquisition. So that question about how long, when should I refer? Anybody ever gotten that like, hey, this kindergartner's been in my classroom for 3 weeks. He's monolingual Spanish speaking, and I think I might need a referral. Like, we really need to change our lens. And again, I'm providing you with your next toolkit item, and that is the stages of language acquisition for our dual language learners. This is, again, very well researched and evidence-based, regardless of our individual factors. We're starting global about research and evidence about dual language learners. And we know that there are these 5 stages. And while you might see some of the terminology vary a little bit, like sometimes they call it pre-verbal or pre-functional, the stages themselves and the principle is very universal. And so we want to talk about these timelines, right? Because that's what I said. I get a lot of questions about timelines. So remember your BICS and your CALP timelines, and now think about stages of language acquisition. So how about that kindergartner who has maybe moved here from Puerto Rico and is now in a language immersion experience in the classroom? It is extremely common that that child will not speak in the classroom. They may demonstrate minimal comprehension, and they will only be working to meet their very basic interpersonal communication needs, like more help, potty. Those are that timeline. Those are things we can expect for up to 2 months for someone who's newly exposed to acquisition of English. Moving on, we have a wider span of 2 to 4 months for a beginning stage. And children who are in a beginning stage of acquiring a second language may use 1 to 2 word responses consistently. I like to highlight responses. We're not even talking about initiation of language yet. We're only talking about responding to someone. They may have multiple mispronunciation of words, and we're still looking at BICS. As we move into stage 3, this span is 1 to 3 years. So again, this aligns with what we just said about BICS. We're still only expecting BICS. And how many kids do you know that we've done this process with who've been exposed to English for a year or for 2 years, and we have all these academic concerns? We haven't even passed that 3-year mark yet, where we would expect them to be demonstrating proficiency with English related to academics. So you can see the rest of the chart that we're looking at 3 to 10 years to be able to engage in complex sentences, discourse, have native-like vocabulary, and narration. Narration is a big one. I love narration. It's an amazing language skill, but look at where it falls on this English language proficiency chart. So we really have to consider if we are placing reasonable expectations on our dual language learners. I think about like, what if I love these hypothetical scenarios. What if I got dropped off in Spain? This sounds awesome, first of all, but what would my experience be like? I would be expected to converse and interact like other adults in that environment, and I would not be able to. I would be in a pre-functional stage of language acquisition. So again, taking into consideration the both BICS and CALP timelines, and then stages of second language acquisition. I hope that, again, you find these really applicable and something that you can use as a consistent resource. When team members say they're worried about so-and-so, then we want to really first, 4 red flags, and what kind of a timeline are we in? I wanted to highlight that there are a variety of these charts out there. I always say like Dr. Google has a lot of them, but I have a couple of recommendations for you to use these charts going forward. The one I provided here is minimized and simplified in a way that it can fit onto a slide. The next thing is that they are much more informative. There's lots of information related to what to expect at the different stages. Again, this one is minimized for presentation purposes. The next recommendation that I have is that you take a moment to go ahead and find out, is one of these charts already being used in your district? Because your ESL staff, they may already have a chart like this that they use to describe the stages of language acquisition. And this is your next action item. And again, I'm all about a working meeting. If you're on topic, go ahead and shoot that email off and say, hey, today I learned about the stages of language acquisition. Do you have a chart that you guys already use? And this really helps make sure that you're using the same terminology, you have the same expectations, just a really great action item. And if they say, no, actually, I don't have one that I use, then you can go ahead and find one. And you're going to find in your participant folder that I gave you access to an entire book. And in chapter 2, they specifically address the stages of language acquisition, again, for second language learners. So I would encourage you to check that out. And your next action item for your case study student, I want you to think about what you know, what you can pull up right now, and what would you say, hypothesizing and predicting if you need to right now, what is that child's stage of language acquisition? And again, this is very, very important preliminary information that you want to gather about a student before you dive deeper into those concerns. Okay. All right. So again, you can take a moment, and if you need to, go ahead and pull up some information to help you determine that. You might need to inquire within your team and get some more information about when they were exposed, typically to English in the school setting. All right, we are going to move on to our third toolkit item, right? So we have our red flags and we have our stages of language acquisition, with kind of like a little addition of the BICS and CALP there. And the third is access scores. And I know that this might be something that you are familiar with. And maybe like me, before you really started committing yourself to this work, you saw them listed in the review of existing data under statewide and district assessments, and you saw those numbers there. But do you understand what they are and how they apply to our evaluation of dual language learners? And through my work in this area, I see that we as special educators, we can benefit from learning more about access scores. So I was telling Andrea, this is usually a point in my topics and my presentations where we dialogue about this and we talk about it. And when I work in this area, you come to me in your teams. So you come to me with your psych and with your EL teacher and any other evaluators that are important to be there. And we work together to make sure everybody's on the same page and we have this established system. So typically we dialogue a lot about what the access scores are, but I will monologue to you. So it's important to realize that your access scores are English language proficiency tests. So they tell us what is the dual language learner's level of proficiency with English. And they are taken annually by all dual language learners identified as such as an English learner in grades K through 12. They assess speaking, reading, writing, and listening in English. And 2.1 million children across 36 states take the access test annually. And this is my interpretation of what the access scores are. They are a gold mine of information, and they help you be so much more efficient because this is a gold mine of information that already exists. You don't have to pull a kid to test them. You don't have to get into the classroom and observe them. You don't need to interview a teacher or a parent. You have this information literally at your fingertips. You just might not know how to access it or how to interpret it. It's always funny when you use the word access, the access, yeah. So it also compares bilingual students to other bilingual students. And remember what we just said, if you want to keep over identifying dual language learners, keep comparing them to their monolingual peers. And to be honest, I know it's hard to find bilingual comparisons. I always tell people, if you find a good one, share it with me because I'm always on the lookout. And this, again, is something that should be thoroughly looked at prior to your referral. So rather than just listing them in the review of existing data as numbers, we want to make sure that the team has truly analyzed and interpreted what do those scores mean? Because like I said, it's a gold mine. And this is where I want to reiterate that if you compare your dual language learner to monolingual expectations of their English speaking peers, this is like comparing an apple to a kumquat. Anybody think it was an orange? It's a kumquat. So I really want that to be one of your major takeaways. And this is very much highlighted in the new criteria, that it's not appropriate to compare our dual language learners to the normative data sets when standardized assessments, because again, that is a monolingual white population, up to and around 70% of that normative data. And so we really need to, that is a huge shift in our lens, that if we keep comparing our dual language learners to monolingual expectations, we will continue to erroneously identify them. And I know that that leaves a lot of people with, well, then what do I do? And this is where our structured approach and some of the toolkit items that we're going to go over come into play. So again, the red flags that I gave you, those are evidence-based for dual language learners. So if you compare your child to those 4 red flags, you're comparing them to criteria that have been found for dual language learners. And similarly, if you compare your child to the stages, the expectations listed in the stages of language acquisition, you are comparing them to dual language learner expectations. And the same applies for access, because all of the individuals who take the access test that provide you that pool of comparison, those are all dual language learners. And so this is our first realization that all of our 3 toolkit items thus far are going to help us compare dual language learners to dual language learner expectations, which, as you can see, makes me happy. So let's talk about what the access scores are and how we interpret them. So we already touched on that they address these 4 areas. You may have seen this type of an image that presents a score in a chart. And again, it's going to give you that proficiency level as well as a scaled score. As we go forward, this is our jam. Look at those areas, you guys. Speaking, writing, reading, and listening. I mean, this is what ASHA says is our scope of practice. And we have this gold mine of information just sitting there waiting for us. It addresses our domains as speech language pathologists. It compares our dual language learners against other dual language learners, like find me something better because there's not much. And what do they mean? So our student is going to be provided with a score in each of these areas, and they align with entering, emerging, developing, expanding, bridging, and reaching. And many of you may know that when a student reaches, there's very specific criteria, but when they are in the 5 to 6 range on their access scores, then the team may consider them exiting ESL services. And so while in special ed, we tend to use different terminology like dismiss, they talk about exiting ESL services. And that's because this is reaching the same level of proficiency as other English speakers. And there are detailed proficiency level descriptors that are provided for each area. And so you can have a summary of what that score means. And one of the action items that I will ask you to take on your tomorrow morning list, the next evaluation that you have for a dual language learner, please ensure that some sort of classification or description is paired with that number. Have you ever seen those numbers listed in there? Sometimes it's just one number and it just says like access 3. Well, what does a 3 mean? When we present a standardized assessment, we don't just say 80 and leave it up to our reader to try to interpret what that 80 means. We want to provide a description or a classification for our team members and for our readers, our parents. And so anytime that you list an access score, or perhaps someone else on your team lists an access score in the review of existing data, please use these tools that we're looking at today to indicate, what does that mean? It's so much more meaningful. And as you do that in the review of existing data, that's going to make that process so much more informative if you actually know, how is this child performing when compared to other dual language learning students? Okay, so moving on, again, I do have a link to this information available. You're going to see it in your participant folder. There's a very thorough document from WIDA that will tell you a summary of everything I'm talking about and how to interpret it when you sit down to do it yourself. The other thing that I would highlight is that it's really important to collaborate with your ESL staff through this process. So they may themselves be learning or growing in their ability to understand and apply access scores, but you can do it together. And so often you may have an amazing resource that you're not tapping into. And if you are someone who feels like they're a little lost in their dual language evals, then you really want to team up. You want to get in touch with that person, start scheduling times to actually look at the access scores with someone who can help break it down for you, talk about it, and help you understand how that student is functioning in relation to dual language learning expectations. And the tool that I mentioned is hyperlinked here and also in your folder. It's the interpretive guide for score reports. And that again comes from WIDA to help you understand how to interpret this information. And I'm going to do just that with you right now. So this is a real student because I have a major issue using like fake contrived case studies. I really dislike when people paint a picture that's like not realistic, but perfectly matches their point. So this is a elementary school girl. I believe she was in second grade and it was near the end of the school year. And these access scores can really be meaningful to help you determine whether to refer, as well as help confirm and add to the results of your evaluation. So we felt confident in that referral. She had already been referred, and I got that referral because I, at that point, as the diagnostician, conducted all of the bilingual evaluations in our moderately sized district. And when I looked at her access scores, we're going to talk about how to use them to feel more confident in your findings and how to interpret them as part of your evaluation. So the composite is a 2.3. So as you may assume, the composite is a conglomeration, an average of all of those. And actually, I think they are weighted. I shouldn't say an average. I believe they are weighted, but it is a compilation of these 4 different areas: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. We're going to pause at composite for a second because what does that tell you? If I were to just tell you that my student got a composite of 2.3, this is where I'm like, there's a gold mine. There's so much more information here that we can tease out. So please don't just list a composite access score, because it really isn't a good representation of your child. It is not holistic. It doesn't look at the fact that they might have strengths and weaknesses across these different domains. So always listing all 4 of the access score areas. Moving on, she had a listening score of 5. So that's quite high if we were thinking about our 1 to 6 scale. And again, I'm hoping that you'll see it as a tool and you can research the definitions of the 1 through 6 further. She was compliant. She was a teacher pleaser. She understood what was being asked of her. Her receptive language, her listening skills in English were very good. However, look at that significant discrepancy between her listening and her speaking. That is significant. And as we move into reading, we have a 3.4, and in writing, we have a 2.5. So the access scores really supported the referral and the main concern. The main concern for her really was around expressive language. And when we proceeded through the evaluation, I know some people are like, tell me what you did, tell me which test to give, tell me how to do it. That's down the pipeline, we'll get there. We have to have this foundational information first, and we have to make sure we're referring the right kids. So upon evaluation, we found that she did have stronger listening comprehension skills than she did expressive language in both Spanish and English. So through a comprehensive evaluation that looked at both languages, She is consistently and significantly higher in her listening comprehension skills than she is her expressive language. And this is where I want to tell you, get together with your ESL folks, because this was like a mind-blowing moment for me when I was starting to learn how to interpret access scores in a more thorough and detailed way. So I sat down with the EL teacher to look at these. And one of the things she pointed out, I, of course, gravitated to that split in the 5-to-1. And she said, yeah, but Courtney, look at her speaking in comparison to her reading and writing. And she said, a typical profile, which I don't know because I don't look at hundreds of these profiles, right? And my EL teachers do. She said, speaking is reliably and consistently higher than a dual language learner's writing and reading abilities. And that makes sense. We know that when we think about BICS and CALP and what we just talked about second language acquisition, my speaking and my listening skills in English should be more advanced than my reading or writing abilities, right? So again, if you have that opportunity and you are monolingual with maybe some exposure to another language, think about your own development and experience. My listening and speaking skills in Spanish are significantly better. I can't even imagine if you asked me to write and read in Spanish. So this is also, using these access scores was proof that she does not match a typical developmental profile for a dual language learner. So I said that these can add to your evaluations and that these can also confirm what you're finding in your evaluations. And that's exactly what the access scores did for this second grade girl. It confirmed that what I found with the split in expressive receptive language was present in her access scores. A lot of SLPs tell me that they find a lot of comfort and validity in this alignment, in saying, okay, that helps me feel more confident in reporting these scores because it's consistent with their access profile. And then secondly, that addition that the EL teacher identified, she does not fit a typical profile for an access score for dual language learners. So that's just an example of how to interpret them, how to apply them and align them with those concerns, and how you might please discuss access scores in your evaluations. Have a whole section in your actual report beyond the review of existing data, because we really want to use this information. Again, you don't even have to work to get it. It's there for you. We just have to work to understand it. So this is where I wanted to talk about those appropriate comparison for dual language learners. And access scores provide us with a zone of proximal development for dual language learners. And if the child is educated in English, the access score is their expected performance range in the classroom. We have to make that connection, that what they demonstrate as an English language proficiency on the access score should be our zone of proximal development in the classroom. Sure, I want you to perform a little bit higher than that, and I want to stretch your learning. But if we have a consistent score in speaking of a 1, we know that that little girl is going to struggle to express herself in the classroom. And we may need to consider if it's a difference or a disorder, and if it is typical for a dual language learner. That was not typical. If you see scores that are typical for a dual language profile, you need to talk with the team about altering the expectations of a typical dual language learner in the classroom. Because why would we expect a child to perform above their English language proficiency level in the classroom? That would be like asking us to supersede our abilities. And this really requires us to reframe our expectations in a way that results in appropriate expectations for dual language learners. And if you continue again to use greater age level expectations meant for English learners, they may continue to appear aberrant. So we just have to be really thoughtful and intentional in the expectations and the comparison that we are using for a dual language learner. And with that, you have your last charge for the day. I want to make sure that you have taken the time to look up the access scores for your case study student. If you are not sure how to access them, then please email someone who can give them to you, and even better yet, show you how to access them for future students. Because again, you don't want to leave this rock unturned. You want to make sure that you're tapping into this information to help you understand your students better. And then a friendly reminder to please specifically ask or look for each of those domain areas: speaking, reading, writing, and listening, not just the composite score. And so we are going to take a moment to have you make sure that you've got those scores. You are welcome to pop anything into the chat regarding your reflection on access scores. So any kind of realization, consideration, reflection, of course, questions that you may have. And then just a preview as we move into the future session, I'm going to take this one step further and help you take access scores more into what to expect of the child in the classroom. And we have a lot of really good resources to do that. So we're going to pause and look at, again, our comparisons to other dual language learners, our red flags, BICS and CALP, and our stages of language acquisition, and our access scores. And that is how you're going to have a good view of your dual language learner that is, again, culturally and linguistically responsive to the fact that they are a dual language learner and should not be compared to monolingual English speaking peers. And then remember that you can apply these at any point in the process. So whether you are in an MTSS or pre-referral stages, or in the beginning stages of an evaluation, or you have a meeting like on Friday, that you might want to review this and embed it right into your report. So again, if you haven't been able to do that, please put this on your follow-up list, on your action item list, to make sure that you've got these for your student. It's also my hope that going through this structured process with a case study student allows you to show this process, your thinking and your steps, to your other team members to really help change how your teams proceed through these evaluations. And unbelievable, I was really wondering how I was going to be doing on time. We are nearing the end, and I want to really acknowledge that thank you for being here. You're already showing a growth mindset, and there is change on the horizon for us. And you can either spend your time fighting the change, or you can be proactive, demonstrate a growth mindset, and move into this willing to learn more, willing to do better for our dual language students. And when we think about that weight on our shoulder, and we think about the special ed to incarceration pipeline, when we think about the gravity of what we're doing, use this as motivation. And I always say, don't let the information we went over today, if it felt overwhelming, you have time to digest. You have resources you can come back to and use. But use that knowledge as power, use it as motivation. Know that you are better armed to make better decisions on behalf of your students. and keep moving through with that growth mindset. And I've had the pleasure of seeing Maya Angelou at an ASHA convention in the past. Did anyone else attend? Throw it in the chat if you were there. That was pretty monumental. And one of her quotes that I really think applies so much to this, and I feel it myself. I may have done hundreds of these evaluations by now, but I always see that I can do better. And I always know that I can learn more or individualize them better and be more culturally aware. Just do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And I know that every one of you was doing the best that you could prior to attending today. You're doing the best that you can for students, and that should be acknowledged. But now that we have these tools and now that we have this information, we want to make sure we apply it. We want to keep doing better. So with that, I did have permission from Andrea to share with you, yes, I am doing this work across the state, and this information spans 3 and sometimes 4 full days of work in your teams to feel like you as a whole, your evaluation team is equipped with a process and a procedure to take on these evaluations. And so I do have a series coming up in CISA 5. These are in person at Portage. And I also have a series coming up through CISA 1, and these are virtual trainings split into half days. So if you are interested, I would love to see you again. I hope to see you in our next upcoming session here. And you can find the flyers for these sessions in your participant folder. So as I mentioned, all of the references are available for you. And we did try to make sure that you had hyperlinks to be able to access those resources. And Andrea is organizing a lot of really great information for you to access on the website. And we've got our part 2 coming up November 3rd. Thank you for the work that you are doing on behalf of students. And until next time.